A topic that I have also covered more intensively in my most recent book, Democracy, the God That Failed, Economics and Politics of Monarchy, Democracy, and Natural Order. If you need only one English book, let it be that one. Let me begin by describing some problems that historians typically face, because what I want to offer here is some sort of revisionist account of modern history, an account of modern history that is different from the account that you find in standard textbooks. History is usually written by the victorious forces in history. Those people who won out, they write history, that's what we typically believe. But it is not always the case that the victorious forces were indeed, so to speak, the right and most promising forces. So as I said, I want to begin to describe the problem that historians typically face. When we observe the sequence of historical events, let's take as example, for instance, feudal Europe was poorer than monarchical Europe, and monarchical Europe was poorer than democratic Europe. We can easily agree about the sequence of events and these descriptions. The question, however, is, was monarchical Europe wealthier than feudal Europe because of monarchy or in spite of monarchy? Would monarchical Europe have been even richer if it would not have come to the establishment of monarchies? And the same with democracy. Is Europe richer, democratic Europe richer than monarchical Europe because of democracy being introduced and supplanting monarchical governments, or in spite of the fact that monarchical governments were gradually abolished and democratic governments took their place? What you immediately realize is that the sequence of historical events cannot tell us which one of these two incompatible interpretations is right. The sequence of events is, so to speak, compatible with both interpretations, with the interpretation to say because of, but it is also compatible with the interpretation to say in spite of. And there exists no statistical test or anything of that sort that could make a decision between these two incompatible interpretations. Let me use another example. The United States in the 19th century was very little taxed, very low taxes, and had almost no regulations. But standards of living in the United States in the 19th century were comparatively low. In the 20th century, the United States is taxed quite heavily, it is regulated heavily, and standards of living are significantly higher than they were in the 19th century. What do we make of this? Do we say because of more taxes and because of more regulations, standards of living increased in the 20th century as compared to the 19th? Or would we have to say, in spite of the fact that the 20th century regulated and taxed more heavily, standards of living were higher. But the standard of living would have been even higher still if we had kept the low level of taxation and regulation characterizing the 19th century. Again, the data of history do not resolve this type of issue, because or in spite of. What we need, what historians then need in particular, is when they want to decide which one of these incompatible interpretation is right and which one is wrong, what they need is theoretical propositions, theories, theorems, which are not themselves dependent on historical experience when it comes to are they true or are they false. That is, we need theory that we might call a priori or logically true theory, not requiring any type of testing. Now, luckily, we do have quite a few propositions, three theoretical propositions of this kind, of which you immediately will recognize they don't need to be tested, they are intuitively clear. That is something that reflects, so to speak, the nature of things. And the Austrian School of Economics is that branch of the social sciences that in the course of time has probably accumulated the largest number of these types of propositions. Just let me read you a few for you to immediately recognize that they are different in nature from, let's say, Germans prefer to go on vacation in Spain as compared with Greece, which might be different in the next year and is always, so to speak, open to hypothetical, is always a hypothesis that requires testing. So very different type of statements I have in mind. For instance, this one. A larger quantity of a good is always preferred over a smaller quantity of the same good. That is a statement that I would present as being non-falsifiable. It is not a hypothesis. Or another one. Production must precede consumption. Production must come before consumption. Or what is consumed now cannot be consumed again in the future. Or another example, if we fix prices below the market level of prices, we will get a permanent shortage. Or another example, without private property in factors of production, there exist no prices for factors of production. And if there exist no prices for factors of production, then we cannot engage in cost accounting. That is, to compare the inputs that go into the production with the value of the output that results from production. That is the difficulty that arises in socialism. Or, a few other examples, an increase in the amount of paper money cannot possibly increase the overall wealth in society. After all, it's just additional pieces of paper. It does not bring one additional piece of butter or one additional car or refrigerator into existence. But what it can do, in increasing the amount of paper money, is redistribute income, existing income. It can make some people richer, those people who get the new money first, and other people poorer, those who get the new money later or not at all. You could also say monopoly, that is the absence of free entry. You cannot produce such and such. Monopoly leads to higher prices than they otherwise would be, and leads to a lower quality of the product than it otherwise would be because they are shielded from potential competitors. You can also say democracy is incompatible, majority rule is incompatible with private property rights. Either there is a private property owner who can determine what to do with his private property, or there is majority rule over what people can do or cannot do. Last example, no scarce resource can be owned by more than one person at a time without causing conflict. Every scarce resource must have just one owner, and if it has more than one owner, then conflicts are bound to arise. Now, these sorts of statements, which there exist many, many more, are of course not a substitute for history. But without acquaintance with these types of statements, historians or those engaged in historical interpretations are bound to make fundamental errors in the interpretation of history. And many historians are, of course, entirely unfamiliar with economics, and history abounds with false statements. And before I come to my actual topic, let me just give you an example of this. There exists a well-known American historian, Carroll Quigley, who taught at Georgetown University, and was also a teacher of Bill Clinton. There's a book on the evolution of civilizations, and in this book he claims, for instance, that the Industrial Revolution, that is a period when we saw great upsurge in production taking place, that the Industrial Revolution was largely caused by the introduction or invention of fractional reserve banking. Now, fractional reserve banking is the form of banking where additional banknotes are printed that are uncovered by gold or silver. So additional pieces of paper besides regular commodity money are brought into existence. So he claims that fractional reserve banking led to an upsurge in industrial production. It should be perfectly clear that this interpretation is false. We can say, despite the fact of fractional reserve banking, the Industrial Revolution broke out. But we cannot say, because of fractional reserve banking, the Industrial Revolution broke out, because we understand, based on economic theory, that fractional reserve banking does not mean anything more than that additional pieces of paper have been brought into existence, which can redistribute existing income, but can never lift the income of all people at the same time. So it's a wrong interpretation. And the wrong interpretation due to the fact that that guy did not know economics. Or take a more recent example, when the Soviet Union, the Soviet Empire collapsed. One of the most frequently heard explanations for that was these countries were economic basket cases because they did not have multi-party democracy. What we know from economic theory, however, is that the economic difficulties in socialist countries result entirely from the fact that there exists no private property in factors of production in these countries. And unless you introduce private property in factors of production, the economic situation will never improve. Whereas if you introduce democracy, that might not have any impact whatsoever on the economic disaster that existed. So we must again say, not because of democracy or the lack of democracy did socialism not work. In spite of the lack of democracy, socialism did not work. And even if we would have had democracy, socialism still would not have worked. So now I want to come to my real topic, this to present you a revisionist account of modern history, using elementary economic propositions. And what I have in mind that I want to revise is the general view that is held, especially by the so-called American neoconservatives, who say it was a great progress when monarchies supplanted the previous feudal system, and it was an even greater advance in human civilization when, beginning with the French Revolution and ending essentially with World War I, the monarchical world was replaced by a democratic world. Let me pause here for a second and point out that, of course, we have nowadays monarchies, Britain and Sweden and Netherlands and so forth, but those, of course, are not monarchies in the sense that I will talk about monarchies. Those are democracies where the monarchs have nothing to say. They are just symbolic figures. All the power rests in parliaments. What I have in mind when I talk about monarchies are classical monarchies where parliaments at best have some sort of advisory function, but the king appoints all positions and so forth. Those types of monarchies died out essentially with the end of World War I. In fact, some American neoconservatives such as Francis Fukuyama have gone as far as to say that we have reached now, with democracy being in place, the end of history. What he means by this is not that there will be no future events taking place, but there will be no ideological revolutions taking place anymore. There will be no theoretical advances taking place in the social sciences anymore. Democracy is, so to speak, the best of all political systems, and all we have to wait now is to see that the rest of the world adopts that too. In this sense, world history has come to a halt with the establishment of democracy. This, by the way, the neoconservatives are, of course, very, very influential in the United States, even though there exist only 30, 35 people of them. Most of them are columnists writing newspaper columns and have great influence on the American administration. And you can hear from the talk of the American administration that this is all neoconservative talking. That is, we have to make the world safe for democracy, and Iraq will be turned into a democracy, and then Israel, and then Palestine, whatever, and then Iran, and then China, and then we are in great shape. Now, let me address the first myth. So my theoretical interpretation will be completely the reverse of this. I want to argue that the transition from feudalism to monarchism was, so to speak, a deterioration, and that the transition from monarchies to democracies was also a deterioration rather than a progressive development. Let me begin with the first myth. That is that the progress or the development out of a quasi-stateless feudal society. You as Frenchmen might have heard about Jean Bachelet, who wrote a book on the origin of capitalism, where he describes the early European development as being basically anarchistic. So almost stateless societies are now transplanted by monarchical states. And let's define what a state is. A state is conventionally defined as an agency that exercises compulsory territorial monopoly of ultimate decision-making, of ultimate arbitration over a territory. That is, the states claim to be the ultimate judges in cases of conflicts. If you have a conflict with him, you might resolve it yourself, but the state would have, so to speak, the last word whether this resolution or this conflict resolution that you come up with is acceptable to him. And importantly, also, I come back to that very briefly again, is that if there is an ultimate judge that comes into play in any case of conflict, then of course this ultimate judge is also the judge in all conflicts involving itself. So if a state agent or the state has a conflict with you, it is the state that determines whether he is right or you are right. And the second part of the definition of a state that follows from being the ultimate arbitrator and judge is this institution can then, of course, also impose taxes unilaterally. After all, I can start a conflict with you and then I just tell you that you have to pay for me to decide that I was right in the conflict. So the taxing power follows from the status of being the ultimate judge. Now, from the viewpoint of consumers, we have learned in economics classes, monopolies are always bad for the following reason. If you are shielded from competition, nobody else can do what only you can do. These monopolists will produce at higher than necessary cost. And the product quality of that, whatever product it is that they produce, will be lower. That is, monopolists charge higher prices than otherwise would be the case and produce products of lower quality than otherwise would be the case. That's why we are typically opposed to monopolies. Now, while any monopoly is, so to speak, a bad deal from the point of view of consumers, the state monopoly of being the ultimate judge is particularly bad, as I already indicated, for the following reason. The state is supposed to be there to protect us, but if the state is the ultimate arbitrator and judge in any case of conflict, what we then can expect is that they might not produce goods at all, that they produce actually something bad. That is to say, they cause conflicts with you and then decide the conflict in their own favor. So they produce, in this case, not just what people would consider to be goods. They produce actually bads, aggression against their own population, that is involving them in conflicts, plus their own decision, and I determine who is right and who is wrong in all of this. You can clearly anticipate what an agency such as this will always strive to do, causing conflicts and then deciding in its favor. And of course, nobody in his right mind would ever accept a monopoly that has the right to unilaterally tax people. Would you ever agree to a deal that would say, you have the right to tell me what I owe you for the services that you provide for me, regardless whether I like these services or don't like these services? And the answer seems to be quite clear. No one would ever be that dumb that he would just make a decision such as this. You can tax me and you don't need my consent to what you want to have from me in terms of taxes. So what we would expect to result from a state is ever higher prices need to be paid for the services, the quality of the services goes down. The services consist to a large extent in simple aggression or provocations, and the tendency is to spend as much as you can in terms of taxes, and in fact do as little of those things that you are supposed to do. Just take a look at police. Budget allocations for police forces go up all the time. When it comes to, are you increasingly better protected against crime, the answer seems to be no. The more money is allocated to those agencies that are to defend you, the less secure you typically become. Let me just take the American example. America has protected its citizens in such a way that people with mere box cutters could take over planes and fly planes into skyscrapers. If there would have been people armed with weapons in that plane, or if the pilots had weapons, of course these people would have been finished very, very quickly. But it was precisely the disarming of the population by the government that was the very cause of this catastrophe that broke loose. And what was the reaction of the government was, now we need even more money. And despite the fact that they already had spies all over the world stationed allegedly to figure out when and where these sorts of things are going to happen. So, first point, the progress that has taken place in the transition from feudal regimes to monarchical regimes has taken place despite the fact that state institutions emerged during this time period. The progress would have been far more drastic if the state would not have come into existence. Let me again, to illustrate this, give you just a few numbers. In the 20th century alone, governments whose task allegedly it is to protect us have in peacetime killed 170 million people. In peacetime. If you add war, it's more than 200, well above 200 million. And if you add to this the number of normal crimes that occurred because government disarmed the public, right? Many crimes would not have occurred if the public actually had remained armed. That is, if you add those to it, then it seems to be quite clear that on the balance sheet, the state is simply disastrous in terms of its success. Every engineer who would have engineered a machinery like this with the design to protect people and would then observe what it really does would have to say, obviously I made a major construction mistake here. So now we come to the second myth. And that is the myth that the transition from monarchical states to democratic states, which, as I said, begins with the French Revolution and then continues gradually through the 19th century. It is basically completed at the end of World War I. That this was, again, a major breakthrough in civilization. And again, they point out, of course, to the fact that aren't we richer today than we were 100 years ago? And clearly, we have to admit, yes, we are in fact richer. But are we richer because of democracy, or would we still be richer without it? Now let's look at what is the fundamental difference between a democratic government on the one hand and a monarchical government on the other hand. From a theoretical point of view, the transition from a monarchical ruler to democratic rulers is no more and no less then let me replace somebody who considers the country as his property. The king considers the country his property, and the people are, so to speak, his tenants who live on his territory, to a situation where the government leaders are temporary caretakers of the country. Now, does that make a difference whether you are considered and consider yourself to be the owner of a country, who has a right, for instance, to pass the country's inheritance to his son or to his daughter, and can sell part or all of it and keep the receipts from the sale for himself, which are characteristics of being owner of something. And the caretaker, on the other hand, cannot determine who will be his successor. If he sells anything of the state property, it will not become his. It will become part of the general state funds. Now, what will be the different attitude that democratic caretakers on the one hand and monarchical leaders on the other hand display? Let me give you an example that makes it perfectly clear. Let's say I give you a house and say you get the house, you become the owner of the house. And then I give you a house and I say to you, look, you can try to derive an income from the house as long as you are in charge of the house. You are in charge of the house for 4 years, maybe for 8 years, but you do not own the house. You cannot sell it and you cannot pass it on in the future. Now, will people act differently depending on whether they own the house or whether they are just temporary caretakers of the house? And the answer seems to be clear as daylight. Of course, the difference will be dramatic. The person who is just a temporary caretaker of a house, his incentive is, I want to maximize the income that I can derive out of this house, regardless of what this does to the value of the house itself. That is, regardless of what happens to capital values. That is, even if the house is a ruin at the end, that is no problem for him. After all, he is not the owner of the house. But his income could have been increased dramatically. He could have rented it to whatever, to 50 people living in the house, in multiple beds and so forth. Whereas his attitude would be, no, of course, since I also own the stock of the house, the capital value of the house, what I do to the house, whatever I do to the house, I will always take into consideration the repercussions that my actions with my house have on capital values. I want to preserve the value of the house because I want to give an intact house to my son or to my daughter. I'm not saying that it happens in every single case, but it should be perfectly clear that on the average, this is of course what will happen. So, kings would have, so to speak, a long-run perspective. Preserves the value of the country because you want to give a country that is decently intact to the next generation. Caretakers take the short-term perspective. Their attitude is, what you cannot rip off and loot in 4 years or 8 years, you will not be able to loot in the future. So you had better loot right now and quick. Very short-term orientation. Now you might say, and this is of course typically advanced as an argument in favor of democracy, that, yeah, but doesn't democracy have the advantage that there exists free entry into governmental positions? Everybody can become prime minister or president or senator or whatever it is. Whereas under monarchy, of course, entry is closed to the position of the king. The king determines who will be his successor, his son or his daughter. There is no free entry into the position of the king. In democracy, everybody has free entry in principle, at least, to become whatever he wants to become. Now the question, is this an advantage or is this actually a disadvantage? No, we have already heard that when it comes to the production of goods, competition is good and monopoly is bad. The question, however, that has to be raised is, do governments actually produce goods, or do governments produce bads? And to answer this, the question has to be, what is necessary for governments, any type of government, to do all these things that normal people consider to be good? Right? Building streets, building universities, building schools, doing this and that. What, however, is required in order for a government to do all these good things? And the answer is quite clear. They must, first of all, of course, tax people in order to finance these good things. Or, alternatively, they must do what counterfeiters do. That is, print additional paper money and finance them with additional paper money. Now, are these things, taking taxes and engaging in counterfeiting, are these things that people demand, for which there's a demand? You see, for goods there's a demand. People demand to have goods. They demand them because they are good. Do people demand to be taxed? Do people demand to be cheated by counterfeiters? And the answer is, of course, no. People consider to be taxed a bad that happens to them. If they would consider to be a good, they would just simply hand over the money themselves, voluntarily. So governments produce something bad. Do we, however, want to have competition in the production of bads? Do we want to have competition, for instance, in the task of who should run a concentration camp? That is, the best commandant of a concentration camp rises to the top. Or would we not, dealing here again with the bad, want to have somebody who is as inefficient as he can possibly be? And yes, this has to be, again, when it comes to bads, we want bad things to be done inefficiently by dummies that don't know what to do. Give you an example. Do you see, if instead of the French government collecting taxes, we would ask Citroën or whatever, Mercedes or BMW, that is regular firms, to engage in tax collections. And the answer is not quite clear. I mean, then we are happy that we have to deal with dumb bureaucrats that try to just rip us off our taxes, rather than having some inefficient and smart people working for Ford and GM being engaged in this activity. We don't want to have competition in bad things. There we want to reduce competition as much as possible. Now going back to the caretaker and the king in this regard. Kings can of course be bad kings. After all, they are governments. All governments are bad. But what happens to bad kings? Well, what happens to them quite frequently, and we can see easily why, is the dynasty out of which the king comes is, of course, interested in preserving the dynasty. So if they have a nutcase running the country, what likely will happen is that some close relative, either they surround this nutcase with some advisors who curtail him, you can't do this, or put him in some cloister or so that he can't do his nonsense anymore, or if you can't find any other solution, a close relative will simply kill him. Kings were frequently killed because of reasons like this, because they were considered to be a threat to the power of the dynasty. On the other hand, because becoming a king is just an accident of birth, it can also happen that kings can be decent and harmless people. That is at least not impossible. They have been trained to become king, and they preserve their realm and do very little bad things. That can happen. Now ask yourself, how is it with these elected caretakers? How do they come to power? And how likely is it that they will be killed if they turn out to be bad guys? Now first the question is, if they turn out to be bad guys, how likely is it that they will be killed as compared to the bad kings being killed? And the answer is, the likelihood is considerably low that they will be killed. Why? Because people anticipate, well, in 4 years we have a chance to just elect maybe somebody else. So 4 years we will just survive these and let things go. Whereas a king stays in power for a long time, killing him is, so to speak, the only option that you have. So there's less resistance against bad caretakers because of the possibility of being replaced by others. And second, the second thing, how do they get into their position? The king gets into it by accident of birth. How do high-ranking politicians reach their high positions? And the answer is, of course, by constantly engaging in demagoguery, in lying, in bribing, in cheating, in being skillful crooks. Look, unless maybe on the local level this might be least pronounced, but if you want to become the American president or the French president, you have to be a professional liar. So you have to think that hundreds of thousands of people know, of course, it's complete nonsense. Nonetheless, you need to say these things, otherwise you will never be elected. Imagine, for instance, there would be a prime minister who would say, I will never take a penny from the rich and give it to the poor, because I respect private property rights. Do you think that this guy has any chance in hell that he will ever be elected to be president in the United States or in France? And the answer seems to be quite clear. Never. The guy will be discarded instantly in the first round of elections. So democracy makes sure almost that only bad guys rise to the top. In kings, accidentally bad guys cannot be at the top. But there can also be harmless guys. Under democracy, there will never be a harmless guy. There will be highly routinized bad guys. And you can always bet your life that any election will bring bad guys to power. Let me point out something else that is typically for democracy and rather untypical for monarchy. A king does not have to engage in massive redistribution of income within the population because he is independent of elections. He doesn't have to just wave around with lots of favors. Yes, he has favorite groups here and there too. But it is not as essential for him as it is for somebody who wants to be re-elected every 4 years. If you want to be re-elected every 4 years, you have to make promises to large groups at the expense of other groups and so forth, hoping that you get the necessary votes for this. Kings don't need these votes at all. So democracy will lead to a massive amount of income redistribution. Always changing coalitions trying to rip off other coalitions. We make two remarks about this redistribution of income and wealth that becomes prominent in democracy. The first, engage in a little thought experiment. Imagine we have one world democracy, one world state, and one man, one vote on a world scale. Now, we can predict roughly what would happen then. Then we will get a Chinese-Indian coalition government, simply by virtue of the votes that they mobilize. So what will the Chinese-Indian coalition government likely do in order to have a chance to be re-elected the next time? Well, again, you don't have to be Einstein to predict that what they will find is, of course, hey, you guys in Europe have fun too much. You know, you have to drive cars and to go on vacations and all the rest of it, and the same in the United States. And we poor guys here, we have to just ride the bike and roll in the mud and can't go to Hawaii and nothing, no fun in life. So massive redistribution of income is in place. Huge amounts of wealth has to be transferred from Europe into the United States to the third world, India and China in this particular case. Well, change the scenario a little bit. What's so great about 18 years? Why not giving the right to vote to people who are 50 or 12? After all, when we started giving votes, most of the age requirements were frequently 30, and then they were lowered and lowered until they are now usually 18. So there's nothing holy or particularly great about 18. Why not 12? What would happen then? Now, we would not get children running government, I would not go that far. But what we can predict, of course, is that all political parties will now take into consideration the legitimate interests of children. Just like they all take into account now the legitimate interests of the elderly. Right? The elderly are very important now that they have health care, that the pension is secure and so forth. And if this is not on the platform, a party is bound to lose. So if all the kids vote, you have to offer them something too. And what you will offer them is like, at least once a week you can go to a video store and get free video rentals. Every kid gets a square meal at McDonald's every day. Once a month there must be a visit to Kids R Us or some outfit such as this. Again, a massive redistribution of income, in this case, to the advantage of children. This redistribution of income and wealth has taken place in all countries as all countries in the course of the 19th century gradually expanded their franchise. At the beginning of the 19th century, the franchise in all European countries and also in the United States was very limited. Only major property owners, only people with relatively high age could vote. A few 100,000, something like this. By the end of the 19th century, almost all countries had universal suffrage for men. Nobody saw, of course, to give the right to vote for women. That was considered to be absolutely beyond the pale. Completely nuts to do this sort of stuff. Interestingly, Switzerland was the first country that gave universal male franchise, but it was the last one in 1971 that also gave the right to the universal franchise to females. So since 1971 it was somewhat down the hill with Switzerland. I'm not against, don't misunderstand me, I'm not against women voting, I'm against men and women not voting. In addition to redistribution, a general characteristic of redistribution is simply this. Look, whenever you redistribute income and wealth from one group to another, it is usually that you punish those people who have something that is considered to be good. And you subsidize people who are somehow deficient in some ways. Right? That's the purpose. You take it from people who have it, from the haves, and give it to the have-nots. Whatever having means and whatever not having means. But by doing this, what you will breed is, of course, less incentives to be among those that do good things and have good things, and increasing incentive for people to display characteristics that we would normally consider to be bad, or have habits that are bad. Like, again, give you an example. If you take money from families with children and give it to unmarried mothers, because they are so desolate that they are unmarried, what is the consequence of this? The consequence of that is, of course, that growth outside of marriage will increase. In America, you can see that quite drastically. I think the numbers for blacks, for instance, before these welfare programs were started, 50% of blacks were born out of wedlock. In the meantime, because they have these programs, 8% of blacks are born out of wedlock. So whatever you subsidize, you will get more of it. And you typically subsidize something bad, so you always get something bad more. Lastly, as far as the comparison between democracy and monarchy is concerned, there exists also a significant difference in the conduct of war between these two types of government. Monarchical wars are typically non-ideologically motivated wars, but territorially motivated wars. They arise typically out of inheritance disputes. A says, I think I'm in line here to take over this village, and B says, I think I inherited that. Now if you have territorial objectives, then you can see that there is at least a possibility of ending wars, to have a criteria when the war is really over. The war is over when you just have occupied the territory that you claim as yours, and then you go home. Now, of course, there's relatively little incentive of the contending kings, so to speak, to destroy these territories, because after all, they don't want to take them over in decently good shape. With democracy come ideologically motivated wars. That is, wars that are similar to the wars of religion. And as you all know, wars of religion were particularly brutal. And so are democratic wars particularly brutal. Because the wars are now over. This begins with the French Revolution. We have to export liberty, solidarity, and fraternity to the rest of the world. But when do you reach this goal? When are you sure that you really converted these people? Right? And it's not so people can say, yes, of course, I'm no longer a Protestant. No, I'm a Catholic. Or yes, I no longer feel like a Prussian. No, I feel like a Frenchman. Well, yesterday I was in favor of tribal government, but now I'm in favor of democracy. How do you know that they don't lie? And the answer is you never really know. The only sure thing is that if you kill them all, of course, then you know that you have actually achieved your objective to wipe out the ideological enemies. You realize that these democratic wars also involve, first of all, drafts. Kings try to introduce the draft, but were generally unsuccessful in doing it because people thought that the king's war, he should fight it with his own resources. I have nothing to say in the state, and I stay out of the war. When you have democracy, then you have a stake in the state, you can vote now. And because you can vote, we can also draft you into the army. Because wars will become total wars and become very difficult to end. Just recall World War I and World War II, which both ended with unconditional surrender that was demanded of the losing parties. Unconditional surrender was something that did not exist under kings. That's when they worked out some sort of compromise pieces. As a matter of fact, most of the kings were somehow relatives of each other. So they were not directly interested in destroying them completely. Now the question, are there then alternatives to monarchy and democracy? Again, the standard view is, of course, democracy, that is the end of human development. Nothing better can ever be designed. So we had better not even think about this possibility. What I want to do is I want to just now introduce the idea of a natural order. I want to explain to you that it's not even difficult to imagine a social system that operates very differently from monarchies or democracies. And I call this system a natural order. Let me describe it first. It would be a system in which all resources, all land, all property is in private hands. All rivers are owned privately, all streets are privately owned, all mountains are privately owned, all factories are privately owned. There exists no such thing as public property. There exists only private property. Now, how would in such a society security produced? That is, all people want to be safe from aggression. And I'm not making the assumption that mankind changes, so to speak, if we introduce a natural order. Mankind is what it is and will never change. There will be always evil people who try to kill other people and so forth. The question is, what is the best way to deal with evil people? The current solution seems to be we make the most evil people rule the rest of the country. That doesn't seem to be a very intelligent solution to the problem. So how would the natural order provide security? First thing, in a natural order, of course, there would, to a large extent, exist self-defense. That's not all, but it is an important component. People would be armed. In America, there's an author, John Lott, who recently wrote a book, More Guns, Less Crimes. The thesis is quite simple, that people who are heavily armed will not be attacked. There are many studies that have been done about the Wild West. What we see in the movies about the Wild West is usually nonsense. The Wild West was a very peaceful type of situation. If somebody would try to rob a bank, he would likely not survive this attack because all bank personnel was armed and the guy would be shot in no time. There was an experiment that was then outlawed by the federal government in the United States, where one village in Florida, or one little town in Florida, outlawed gun ownership completely. and another rival village town that wanted to show them off, said, in our village, everybody must have a gun. Now you can roughly predict in what these two places crime rose and what of these two places crime fell. Obviously, robbers and murderers and rapists, of course, are also not dumb people. So, I mean, they pick their targets according to some perception of this is dangerous or this is not dangerous. Of course, you go to the place where you know nobody has a gun. So there would be massive amount of self-defense. Secondly, a very important function in these natural order societies, in order to provide security, would be provided by insurance companies. Insurance companies already now do a certain amount of protection, as we all know. And they would take on a far more important role if they were only let to do so. Let's first ask the question, would an insurance company that insures your property and promises you to indemnify you in case something happens to your property, would an insurance company insist that you have to disarm yourself in order to get insurance from them? Well, the answer seems clear. No, an insurance company would actually encourage that you have arms. Why? Because it makes the incident of events for which they have to pay lower. Insurance companies would usually offer you a lower premium if you could prove to them that you have a gun at home, that you know how to handle the gun, and the insurance premium would be still lower if you could prove that you can shoot somebody between the eyes from 500 yards away. In the same way as insurance companies charge lower premiums, for instance, when you have a safe at home, instead of leaving your jewelry on the kitchen table, you have a safe. Of course, the insurance company will recognize that, and you will pay less in premium than a person who does not have a safe. Yeah. In contrast to this, as we all know, governments, of course, everywhere, including in the United States, have made constant efforts to disarm the population. Make them helpless. After all, they are in the business of ripping people off. If you want to rip people off, then of course it is good that these people cannot defend themselves by any means. Insurance companies would do exactly the opposite. They would encourage gun ownership rather than increasingly outlawing it. Secondly, insurance companies are by their very nature defensive organizations. Look, states tend to be aggressive institutions for a very simple reason. States can make other people, through tax payments, pay for their own aggressiveness. Would the United States go to war against Iraq if they let their own population decide whether they voluntarily want to contribute something to the war? You can be sure that there would be millions of Americans who would have said, look, I want to have nothing to do with this war. From me, you will not get any penny. There might be others who would give them money. But of course, the aggressiveness of the United States would be substantially reduced if they did not have the right to tax people. If you can tax, of course, you will become more aggressive because you can externalize your costs onto others. Insurance companies, living, so to speak, from voluntary contributions, would insurance companies have a tendency to go to war against each other? Yes, it's not very likely. Why is it not very likely? If an insurance company goes to war against other insurance companies. What does that mean in terms of the premiums that the clients of this insurance company will have to pay? They will have to be paying higher insurance premiums than those companies that restrict themselves to strictly defensive activities. Insurance companies will also exclude, so to speak, the coverage of provocative or aggressive behavior on the part of the insurance takers. An insurance company can protect me from he trying to kill me or attack me. But if I have first provoked him, and then he smashes me in the face, and then I go to my insurance company and say, look, this guy smashed me in the face, then the insurance company will say, yeah, but you provoked him first. And since you provoked him first, this risk is of course excluded. This is not covered. We will protect you if he is the aggressor, but you were the provocateur, and he was just engaging in some sort of defensive action, so of course we will not protect you in this case. So the defensive character of insurance companies cannot be emphasized enough. Now look at the incentive structures of what insurance companies, the incentive structures that insurance companies face. First of all, insurance companies have to offer their clients a contract which stipulates what they will do in what case. It should be clear that governments do not offer any contracts. You don't know what governments do when such and such happens. Governments also change the rules of the game as the game is being played. That is something that might be legal today, might be declared illegal tomorrow, or vice versa. Insurance companies could not say, look, I'll give you a contract, but unilaterally I changed the contract. Next week I scratch out this paragraph and the next one that paragraph and so forth. Nobody would ever insure himself with such an agency. Insurance companies indemnify. That is, if they don't deliver, so to speak, they have to pay something for you. Do states indemnify you? That is, they are supposed to protect you. If they don't protect you, do they say, oh, we are really sorry, here you have $1 million compensation for this. If you find states like that, let me know. I might move to a place like this. Of course they don't do this. Now the incentives. People want to be protected in their property, and that involves first prevention. But it doesn't happen at all. What is the incentive of a policeman who is funded out of taxes to engage in preventing crime? And the answer is very minimal. After all, he might get involved in trouble if he tries to prevent crime. So it's better that he hangs out at some cafes and eats croissants and drinks beer and or gives parking tickets to people. Insurance company, on the other hand, every prevention of a crime means we don't have to pay in this case. So there's a financial incentive to be good at prevention. Next thing that people want is, so bad things have happened, my stereo, my car has been stolen. What is the likelihood that government police financed out of taxes will find your stereo and your car? Well, if that has ever happened to you and you have called police and you stole my car, my stereo, the answer, you know roughly the answer. Well, so what? Come here and fill out a piece of paper, you need that for insurance purposes, but nobody ever looks for anything. Insurance companies, of course, have an incentive, especially when the things that have been stolen are valuable, to actually find these things. Insurance detectives have an incentive to rediscover these things, because otherwise the insurance company would have to pay new things. So insurance detectives find stolen cars. Police find stolen cars only if they stumble across them. Last thing is, no, we want to apprehend the bad guys. Get the criminals. Now, how good is the police when it comes to getting the criminals? Now, if we have capital crimes, there is public opinion pressure and so forth. They might get the murderers. Takes them long enough, but maybe they find them. But for crimes below capital crimes, the likelihood that people are found is again very low. As a matter of fact, it is dangerous to just run after criminal types. Maybe they shoot at you. And if they do find them, what do they do then? Well, then they put them in prison. And who pays the bill for people who sit in prison? One of them will be the victim himself. As a matter of fact, in the United States at least, prisons are sometimes so comfortable that people in the winter time decide deliberately, when they can no longer sleep on the streets, that it's time to be incarcerated. So they commit some crimes, then they get a nice apartment there, much better than what they have at home. Then they can play table tennis, watch TV, study law so that they can sue the police. And they have walk-off rooms to be taller so that the next wave goes faster and quicker with less resistance. Then they complain that they don't get their right muesli in the morning, this sort of stuff. Terrible. So insult is added to injury. The cost of an incarceration, I think in the United States, if I remember roughly, is $70,000 per person per year. That's how expensive this is. Paid, of course, by the victims. And what is the purpose, the general purpose of punishment? Is of course to make the victim as whole as we can possibly make. The victim is the one that is victimized and should be helped. We should not feel sorry about the criminals. What would the insurance company do? First of all, they would more likely fine them, because if they find them, what can they do to them? Then they can put them to forced labor, to repay to the victim as much as needs to be repaid. And this seems to be the purpose of punishment. Well, the victim has to be made whole. We don't care about the criminal. So it would be efficient also in the punishment aspect of things. Insurance companies would then also, likely either in conjunction with other firms or as a subdivision of their own, engage in judicial decisions. There would be competition in judgments. Remember, the state characteristic was there's a monopoly judge. If you have many insurance companies, you have many judges now. What would insurance companies, what sort of judgment would they offer? There are three cases that we can consider. Let's say I'm insured with the same company as you are insured. And we have a conflict with each other. Everybody knows that that can happen, that two people who are insured with the same company can have a conflict with each other. Now, in this case, the insurance company will, of course, in its contract have provisions what to do in such a case. If you and I, both being members of the same insurance company, have a conflict, they will say such and such a procedure will be set in motion, and such punishment will be imposed if we find that he is right or he is right, and so forth. That's not really different from the way it is now. The second case is the case where you and I are insured with a different company, but both companies come to the same agreement. So both say, I'm right and you are wrong. In that case, of course, again, both insurance companies have, of course, a provision for this contingency, because everybody knows that that can occur. That is, people insured with different companies have conflicts with each other. In that case, again, whatever the verdict of the insurance company is, that will be enforced. They agree on it. And then there is third, the seemingly most complicated case. That is, I'm insured with one company, you are with another company, and the companies don't agree. My company says I'm right, and your company says you are right. What happens in such a case? No. Would the companies now go to war over such a thing? And I've already explained that. No, insurance companies have a financial interest to minimize risk. They don't go to war over things like that. That means they would have to charge higher premiums to their clients and would lose clients as a consequence of it. Again, this possibility can of course predict it, that we are insured with different companies and the companies have a different assessment of the situation. So there will be provisions also in the contract what happens in such cases. And what the provisions will be can also be easily predicted. That will be, they will say, we will in this case resort to independent arbitration. That is, somebody who is neither a member of company A nor a member of company B will make the decision who is right and who is wrong. They might have actually several appeals procedures in this. It depends how rich or poor societies are. Obviously, very poor societies cannot afford to have whatever 20 appeals courts. If you are a very rich society, it is possible that there will be more appeals provided for. You realize how appeals procedures are handled currently with the monopolist being in charge. So the policeman beat you up. You complain, the policeman is found right by the first judge. Then you appeal this verdict. Who is then the next judge that decides whether your appeal is justified or not? A member of the same firm, of the same company, also a state judge. If you go to the next high level, it's again a member of the same firm. It's not an independent arbitrator. His interests are always siding with one side and not with the other. These independent arbitrators know that they must not be again chosen as arbitrators. They have no guarantee that in future cases the insurance companies will choose the same arbitrator. If the arbitrator comes out with judgments that are considered to be crooked by one company or the other company, he can be pretty sure that next time he will not be an arbitrator. So what is the incentive of the arbitrator who knows I can lose my job? The incentive is to find a judgment that can be regarded as fair by both companies and all of their clients, because otherwise clients will drop off from various companies. And that means the independent arbitrators have, so to speak, an incentive to find a highly consensual solution to the problem at hand, which is what one wants when one wants to get justice. Okay, that should be it, except a few words about strategy. That is, how does one get from the current status system to a natural order? This is, of course, one of the trickiest questions, and I wish I had more and better things to say on these questions than I actually do. when we still had monarchs, some libertarian reformers, so to speak, or classical liberal reformers, thought it might be possible to simply infiltrate the ruling class, the monarch, to become the advisor of the monarch, turn it into a liberal or a libertarian, and then the monarch would just implement a natural order by itself. One example, for instance, of something similar happening in history was the Austrian Crown Prince Rudolf, who committed suicide at Mayerling in the 1880s, was tutored by Karl Menger, who was the founder of the Austrian school. And Karl Menger had hoped that he would turn Crown Prince Rudolf into a free marketeer. And then once he would come into power, he would then reform Austria according to free market principles, so to speak. But as you see, there's a certain risk involved in this type of conversion strategy. The poor Rudolf picked the wrong girls and then in some sort of suicide pact disappeared from the world, and Karl Menger's plans were out the window. Under democracy, you see, it is far more difficult to do this. Right? The majority would not voluntarily decide to give up voting. And even if one president resigns from his post, then somebody else will simply take his position. Under democracy, the reform has also become more difficult. What possibilities of reform do we have? And I think the most promising one to approach the situation is the way of secession. Secession is undemocratic because it is smaller groups secede from larger groups. By smaller groups seceding from larger groups, the smaller the territory, the more they must engage in free market policies. Just look at the small countries that we have nowadays: Singapore, Hong Kong, Liechtenstein, San Marino, Monaco, places of this kind. Could places like this engage, for instance, in protectionist measures? Just say, we don't trade with the rest of the world anymore. We have huge import tariffs and huge export tariffs. Now, if they would do it, they would be dead in very short time. If the United States, as a big country, would do that, standards of living would fall in the United States, but people would not necessarily die. The smaller the territory, the greater is the pressure that you must adopt free market policies. Also for reasons of migration. Imagine you have a world state with the same regulation and tax structure imposed. Wherever you go, it's just the same. There's no reason for economically motivated migration anymore. But imagine that you have hundreds or thousands of places like Monaco, Liechtenstein, and so forth, thousands of independent cities. The migration possibility would be massively enhanced. And when people run away from a state, that makes states, of course, reluctant in their tax and regulation policy. One of the standard explanations for why did Europe become richer than other regions in the world, let's say like China and so forth, despite the fact that China made most of the inventions before they were made in Europe. One of the fundamental reasons for this is the fact that Europe was splintered up for a long time into thousands of independent political units, with heavy competition and each government being relatively weak and liberal because they had to fear migration. So my proposal to approach a natural order is to promote as an intermediate step the step of massive secession of regions and cities and towns and create a situation similar to what we had in the Middle Ages. Contrary to the United States dream of creating a one world government, of course controlled by the United States, but self-understood, contrary to that, we should have a great multiplication of independent political units, each of which engaged in free trade, relatively low taxes, low regulation, interconnected to an international gold standard, and then go from there and establish a genuine natural order. Thank you.